Today, the section that we're going to be looking at is Israel coming close to the physical promised land for the first time, and something that I just wanted to mention here in the very beginning. Occasionally, especially not in our fellowship, but you'll hear people talking about Israel reclaiming the land or Israel receiving the land as if they never did get it the first time. And I just wanted to note these. The very first thing, God is going to promise Abraham, and there's up to 7 of these when you subdivide all of them, but I think the easiest way for me to remember them is that God promises them descendants. So the word seed is going to become very important, especially when you come into a book like Galatians. He's going to promise them the land, and through you, I'm going to bless all nations. So what is significant, and I think of this very literally and have mentioned it on another occasion. God tells Abraham in Genesis 13, lift up your eyes and look from the place where you are, northward, southward, eastward, and westward. For all the land which you will see, I will give you and your descendants forever. I will make your descendants as the dust of the earth, so that if one could count the dust of the earth, so your descendants will be counted. And so Abraham literally walks the length and the breadth of the land, but during his lifetime, he doesn't receive any of it. And it's always kind of sobering that at the very end of his life, the only thing that he technically owns is the cave of Machpelah, where he buries his wife. And yet God promised him this. And so we're going to have a 400-year interval. The people are going to go into Egypt, and they have approached the promised land the first time. The spies went out, and Kadesh Barnea, and this will be like Numbers 12, 13, and 14. At Kadesh Barnea, the people rebelled against God. They believed the 10 spies that they couldn't do this, and an entire generation of people were buried in the desert. And that's just, you just kind of shudder when you think of that. I have a friend, just using one of our analogies, he said, every time I read through Numbers, as I come to Numbers 13, spiritually, he's talking about, the wheels of the wagon fall off. And God's made these promises, and they refuse to accept them. And as a consequence of that, and it's just kind of hard for us to comprehend, an entire generation of people are going to die. And on more than one occasion, as we mentioned last week, God will tell Moses, just step aside, and I'm going to wipe out the whole group of them, and I'll start all over with you. And that's still just kind of stunning that God has been working on this closer to 500 years by the time you take the life of Abraham. And he is going to fulfill his purposes, whether people cooperate with him or not. And if they choose not to, then he'll have another plan, another path to do that. But because of Moses' intercession for the people, then that didn't happen. And so number 2 is very significant. The promise to the land will begin eventually as we come to Joshua, and they will cross over and they will begin to take the land. But it will really be until the time of David, which then is going to be several hundred years after that, that they finally acquire the length and the breadth of the land that God promised them. And so these are ongoing promises that God is going to fulfill. This will be fairly brief in terms of for the amount of material that's there, but I just want to summarize just kind of in a sentence the latter part of the book of Numbers. And most of the time, and the Numbers, it's not a bad term because there are census and the people are given an account of their numbers and the tribes. But when I think of Numbers, I prefer the Hebrew Bible has the term in the wilderness. And while we don't get all the details of the 40 years, we get the events that lead up to their wandering in the wilderness, and then at the very end as they come back. And so this latter part of Numbers is going to be the journey from Kadesh Barnea, where the rebellion took place, to Moab, where they're going to initiate getting ready to enter into the land. 1:1 is just very, very serious and very, very sobering. The people are murmuring, complaining again, which is kind of a constant refrain on their part. And God tells Moses to speak to the rock, and in his anger, he's going to strike the rock, which is what God told him to do the first time. And we're going to come back and talk about this a little bit later. God is very serious about obedience. And let me process just for a second. The part that I still struggle to understand is that with God being totally holy and sinless, and because we are neither of those in 100%, then it's hard for us to kind of comprehend God's actions and God's motives from the perspective of someone who's totally holy and totally sinless. And his abhorrence, his even punishment eventually for sin, and was talking about this earlier about it's very, very sobering, the number of people that die because of disobedience. If memory serves me correct, there were like 24,000 people that died in the plains of Moab because they had committed immorality. This is going to be a part of Baal worship, and this is a whole lesson within itself. But at the heart of Baal worship, yes, there was an image, but let's use the term sacred prostitutes. The men were to go into these sacred prostitutes as a part of the life cycle through the year, and this was a part of worship. And when you see God's people join themselves, then literally it's going to be sexual immorality. And because of that, and as the serpent is lifted up, then 24,000 people are going to die. But we'll come back to this particular thing. And what's tragic from our point of view, from a human point of view, for all the things that he does well and all the things that he puts up with, because of this, he is not able to enter the promised land. And that's just a very sad and kind of sobering thing at the same time. When you look at 1:2, his brother Aaron is going to die on Mount Hor, and his son Eleazar, and this will begin the succession of the high priest, will become Israel's second high priest, and the people will mourn for Aaron. And in 1:3, the people will continue to murmur, and God will send fiery serpents which will kill the people, and you'll see this in Numbers 20. And as this is taking place, then Moses makes a bronze serpent and is told to lift up the serpent, and the people who are able to see the serpent and look upon the serpent are the ones who don't die. Later, the serpent's going to become an idol. And you start looking at the Ten Commandments, only to worship God, do not build any images, and even something that initially was the plan of God to help save the people being bit by the serpents, the people are going to use in a way that he didn't intend for them to do. When you come to Numbers 21, as they make their way closer to the promised land, then they defeat a number of their enemies. And I chose not to spend a lot of time on this, but this whole thing with Balak and Barak is always very interesting because I use the word mercenary. The king comes to Balaam and tells him, I want you to curse the people, and money's involved in this. And you have these 3 different times that this takes place, and there's a number of events and things that happen. And one of our late teenagers said to her dad, because of this reading, I had no idea that God spoke through a donkey. And you read through this whole discussion, and there's just some very interesting things that happen. And in the end, again, God's purposes are going to prevail even with people who are fighting against them. So again, here's 1:6. 24,000 Israelites are going to die and playing the harlot, sexual immorality of the people of Midian. A new census is taken to assist with the division of Canaan. And this is a part of initially sending the spies in to look at the land. And they are going to number the people, and the land is going to be divided up in proportion to the population of the different tribes. Instructions are given again for the annual festivals. And this is something we'll come back at a later time and talk about, but let's just review really quickly. The Passover is going to take place, and obviously we know the adjustments of the moon and the seasons and the time, but the Passover is going to take place. Pentecost with the 5 is going to be literally 50 days later. And so with Passover taking place on a Saturday, on the Sabbath, then you're going to go 7 times 7, 49. And so Pentecost would be observed on what we call the first day of the week. And let me just do this in a couple of sentences, and we'll introduce this, we'll come back to. When you look at the cycle of the agricultural year, the barley harvest, and barley ripens quicker than wheat, the barley harvest will be completed before the Passover each year. And if we lived up in Galilee, then it's approximately 90 miles from Galilee down to Jerusalem. How long would it take you to walk to Tulsa? And then those times that then there's women and children. This is a major excursion on foot. But I like to have something kind of physically that I can identify with, and that's one way. And so they're going to get the barley harvest finished, then they're going to make the trip down to Jerusalem, and that will be for Passover. They're going to come back, and in the meantime, the wheat ripens later than the barley, and in between Passover and Pentecost, the wheat harvest comes in. And living out on the prairie, these guys start in South Texas, cut wheat all the way to Canada. And boy, when the wheat harvest is on, you don't go fishing, you don't fix stuff. Everything is just focused on that one thing, getting the wheat harvest in. And when the wheat harvest is done, then they make the trip back to Jerusalem, and that's Pentecost. And when you see these instructions about waving the first crops, then there will be some of the first crops of the wheat. Then in the fall, into October, then the other crops, everything from grapes, olives, all the trees and the fruit and everything else has been harvested. And then they go back to Jerusalem a third time, and it will be called either the Feast of Booths or Tabernacles. There's a third word that is used. They camp out for a week. Have you been to a Boy Scout, Girl Scout jamboree? We had a scoutmaster that could make to die for peach cobbler in one of those black ovens. And if you go to a Boy Scout jamboree and people are in tents, there's all these smells and fragrances and everything. And so for the Feast of Booths or Tabernacles, they would go to Jerusalem again in the fall. And because all of the annual harvests have been completed, then the feasts take place after those, and they would build shelters, tabernacles, booths, and they would camp out for a week and worship. And this is just my term, of the three feasts, the feast of the year is going to be the Feast of Booths or Tabernacles. I don't want to be irreverent, but it was kind of like the Jewish Thanksgiving. Okay? And you think about the number of people that travel here in the States and all the things that take place, then that's going to be the festival or the feast at the end of the year. I've told you growing up, we would have 90, 100, 110 people come for Thanksgiving. So Sharon, if it's at your house, all you need to do is either 5 turkeys and 4 hams, or 4 hams and 5 turkeys, and we'll bring everything else. And so we'd get together and have 90 to 100 plus people together. Great time of the year. Most of the harvest are done. We enjoy the fall season. And so these were and let me spell, F-E-A-S-T-S. And as we're going to see, there was only one fast prescribed in the Old Testament, and that's going to be the Day of Atonement, which is going to take place before that. And I have an older friend that says these people must have been members of the church because they believed in prayer and feasting. And that's what these festivals were. And it was a great time for people to gather together to worship and to share in those kinds of activities together. So we're going to see in 1:9 instructions for dividing up the land. are going to be made, and unique cases, like with the inheritance. What happens if we only have girls? How do we divide the land up? And those other things are going to be covered at the end of Numbers. When you come to the book of Deuteronomy, Deuteronomy is such a significant book because sometimes it's given as the second giving of the law. It's a summary that Moses is going to give the people before he dies. And what is significant is that because the second time he struck the rock rather than speaking to the rock, he knows that physically he's not going to be able to go into the promised land. And I don't know, it's sad, and my heart goes out to him because of all the things that he did and all the service that he performed. And in some ways, the worst part of it is just dealing with the continual unhappiness of the people, murmuring, complaining, and he was so frustrated. And when you read parts of Deuteronomy, he's pretty specific. He lets them share part of the blame in terms of his actions. I was so exasperated would be a very loose translation. I was so angry with you. And an amazing man, but because he knows he is not going to be able to enter into the promised land, then Deuteronomy is the collection of his thoughts and his ideas and his exhortations before the people themselves will go in. 2:1, early part, Moses will give some geographical details concerning their journey, and he's going to keep a log as they go through. And as we mentioned in the book of Numbers, the significance of the rebellion at Kadesh Barnea, Numbers 12 and 13, then thousands of people are going to be buried in the desert. And this is a part of their 40 years of wandering in the desert. Under 2:1, we'll come back to this, Joshua is selected as the leader. And there's about 8 different things, and we'll just mention a couple of them, but there's about 8 different things that Moses and Joshua do together to equip him and prepare him to become the leader. And we'll be talking about that in terms of the church. We always need to have an eye and an ear on the upcoming generations and help kind of equip and prepare people, just because the transitions of life happen all too quickly. Have mentioned this to you when my brother Kent went to Australia. The elders at 29th and Yale had sent him, and they had worked 2 years with 29th and Yale in Tulsa. And I think it was within 3 or 4 years of their being in Australia, not one of the original 5 elders is still an elder. They're older, and so a couple of them have passed away, some had retired, and something that the church always needs to be thinking about is preparing and equipping the next generation to lead and to be faithful. And Moses is probably as good example as anyone because of the investment that he's going to make in Joshua. There are going to be some early military victories, and one of these first things that is done is that Joshua is selected as virtually the general of the army to help be involved in these. The division of the land and trying to sort out where everyone's going to live is a very, very important thing. One of my friends was at a congregation, and they built a new church building, and this was in Kansas, and the church had been in this old building for maybe 40 years, and he said, I wish we could have had the land run and let everyone choose the part of the building that was theirs, but everyone had gone in as the building's being constructed, and I'm going to put my teaching stuff here and here. And he said it took 6 months to sort out all the territorial disputes of moving into a new building, because people had come in and I think this would be a good place for this and a good place for that. And so if you're going to have, thousands of people moving into the promised land, okay, if you're in the tribe of Judah, here are your boundaries, here's where you're going to live. And this is a part of why the genealogies and the census are so important. The reminders given in 2:3, Moses is forbidden to enter the promised land. And we're going to have some of these wonderful exhortations, and we'll be reading some of these from chapter 6. But Moses is going to exhort the people to obey God's commandments. He will repeat again the 10 commandments, which are kind of the essence, the core, the kernel of the covenant that's going to be made. And God is going to continue to give instructions to Moses. And the thing that's significant is that at least twice, Moses goes up on the mountain and spends 40 days with God. And at times, Joshua is able to go. The elders sometimes go part of the way. And because of the thunder and the lightning and the earthquakes, the people are quite glad for Moses to do that. And just the appearing of the presence of God, there's just all of these physical phenomena that take place, but Moses is in the presence of God over and over and again. 2:7, and again, for us, this is harder for us to kind of comprehend. God commands as they go in, because of the nature of the idolatry that's there, they're to exterminate, they're to wipe out the inhabitants of the land. And that seems very harsh for us. But on the other hand, when you notice when they didn't do that, what's going to take place? Then the Israelites are going to learn the habits and the practices of the people. And the part that's just kind of hard to comprehend is that by the time we come to Jeremiah, and this will be 1,000 years later, then the people are more immoral than the initial people were that they were to destroy when they went into the land. And like Jeremiah is going to say, there are as many idols in Jerusalem as there are cities in Judea. And then on another occasion, he'll say, there's as many idols in Jerusalem as the streets of Jerusalem. And so the tragedy is that because they didn't do this and they learned their practices, then by the time we come toward the end of the Old Testament, God's people have perfected the idolatry and the immorality to even a larger degree than the people that they were originally to wipe out. We're going to look at this in a little bit, but chapter 7, and obviously with the number 7, it's easy to remember, but chapter 7 is very significant because God is very clear. I didn't choose you because you were just irresistible. I didn't choose you because you were strong. I didn't choose you because you were powerful. And in fact, he's going to say when you were weak and when you were few, and specifically you were slaves in Egypt, then that's when I chose you. And God choosing his covenant people is, I use the term the rationale, is given in chapter 7. And the call is to say, do not fear and do not learn the practices of the Canaanites, which they are going to do in time, and especially when we get into the book of Judges. And then we come to chapter 8. God's going to be very specific. You were delivered because of my might and my power. Basically, when you were helpless, when you physically were unable to free yourselves from slavery, then I delivered you from that. And then you hear a verse saying, while we were weak and we were powerless, what happened? Christ Jesus died for the ungodly. And what God is going to do physically with the deliverance of Moses to bring them out of physical slavery, in the same way, when we were unable to restore the relationship with God, when we were weak and we were powerless, Christ Jesus died for the ungodly. And there's going to be a similar spiritual parallel with us in the New Testament. So there's 7 things I want us just to kind of highlight before we finish. And I know we're strung out a long ways. Is it fair that Moses isn't allowed to enter the promised land because of one, and I put in marks, major sin? Okay, it has to be fair because God did it. Hmm? Yes. Any other thoughts? Good. And I keep hearing Isaiah say, my thoughts are not your thoughts, my ways are not your ways. As the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways and my thoughts higher than yours. And I agree with what Bill said. We acknowledge God as God and he does what's right and fair. But there's also a sense just from a human point of view, and that's why I say my heart goes out to him. How do I say this? I grew up in a family where there wasn't a lot of murmuring and complaining because we got warned once and then we were struck by lightning. Dad just told us one time, and if it wasn't done, then there were direct consequences, and we just didn't have a lot of fussing and fighting. It might have been healthier if we did, but we didn't. And well, let me just do this real quickly. When we lived in Memphis, we worked with a church in Mississippi, and there were two ladies in the church that were housebound. And one lady, I just called her Sister Awful because nothing was good. The food wasn't good, the doctor visit wasn't good, the weather wasn't good. And bless her heart, it was just, can I say honestly, it was just depressing to go visit her because you just felt like, you had this rainy cloud hanging over you. I don't ever remember, maybe 5 or 6 visits, I don't ever remember her saying one thing that was constructive or positive. On the other hand, not too far away was Sister House, and Sister House had taught a one-room school for 40 years. And that makes my head hurt every time I think about it. So she taught ABC and chemistry. And she had a whole group of kids that went to Ole Miss and Mississippi State and got degrees, and they had had one teacher when they went to college or university. And those of you who teach on any level at all, you just imagine teaching a one-room school for 40 years. Before she had her stroke, she read every word of the Wall Street Journal each day, just so I know what's going on in the world. And so you can imagine her disposition and her temperament was just totally different. And so I quickly learned I would not go visit Sister Awful until I could go straight to Grandma House's house and see her because it was just such a contrast. But I go one day and she's visibly upset, which is so out of character. And I said, Grandma House, what's wrong? And she said, well, since I've had my stroke, I sit here every afternoon and I put the Old Testament together. And I can't remember if Habakkuk comes before or after the fall of Jerusalem. And I won't be able to sleep tonight if I can't figure that out. Can you help me? You could have just knocked me down. I'm thinking, how many people are going to lose sleep tonight because they can't remember if the book of Habakkuk came before or after the fall of Jerusalem? And I said, I think I know, but let me check so I don't confuse you. And then I looked and I said, no, he's going to become before because he's a contemporary with Jeremiah. But the difference in the temperament of the two people was just so stark and so contrast. But just imagine leading the state of Oklahoma, population-wise, something close to that, and they're never happy. The water's not good, the food's not good. And so I'm empathetic with Moses. And as I told you earlier, when the people tell Joshua, we're going to follow you just like we did Moses, that's when I would have resigned. I said, God, I'm done. I don't want to do this. And the reason I want to mention this is that we all need to encourage and appreciate our leaders, our elders. There are always some things that elders know that's really not appropriate to tell the rest of us. Just the reality of life. And there's a major responsibility. And you see the shepherding that God is going to have Moses do physically for 40 years is then going to be used spiritually in dealing with these people. And yet it's sobering that he didn't enter the promised land because of what he did. And look at the verses. This is number 2. God is serious about obedience. The Lord said to Moses and Aaron, because you did not believe in me, to sanctify me in the eyes of the people of Israel, therefore you shall not bring this assembly into the land which I have given them. and God is God, and he's to be honored and revered as God. And in his anger, by striking the rock instead of speaking to it, then Moses is kept out. A little bit later, we're going to hear Samuel say to Saul, to obey is better than sacrifice, and that to me is a very significant lesson. Number 3 is that as you read through the Old Testament, sometimes what is not just a major event is going to be picked up later, both by Christ and by writers of the New Testament, and is going to have a significance in the New Testament that we would never understand or appreciate that it would have in the Old. And if you notice, Moses, we mentioned this, lifted up the serpent in the wilderness. And then here's a quote from John 3. Jesus says, "If I have told you earthly things and you do not believe, how can you believe if I tell you heavenly things? No one has ascended into heaven but he who descended from heaven, the Son of Man. And as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, so must the Son of Man be lifted up, that whoever believes in him may have eternal life." And then later, we're about into the triumphal entry in the upper room. The judgment of this world, the ruler of this world will be cast out, and I, if I be lifted up from the earth, will draw all men to myself. And he said this to show what kind of death he was going to die. And so to me, this is just a perfect example, is that we're reading through, these events take place, and because of the murmuring and the complaining of the people, the serpents come among them, and Moses lift up the bronze serpent. And then Jesus, and if you want to use the term type, shadow, echo, then Jesus is going to use this occasion in the Old Testament in mentioning his prediction about his death that's going to be on the cross. On the backside, and we won't read all the verses on these, but I like the term passing the baton. It's just something that every congregation should take very seriously, and it's so true, but I always grew up hearing every church is one generation away from what? Apostasy. And it's very important, both within our personal families and our spiritual family, that we're very focused on helping to develop and to create. My term is to put fingerprints of faith on the next generation. And I want us just to be thinking about different ways that we can do that, both in our families and also as a congregation. The first example, Aaron is going to die, very specific, and his son Eliezer, the name means God is helper, and they go up into the mountain. Aaron takes off these garments, and Brother McCord had an expression. He said, the garments of the high priest were much like a peacock, huge amount of colors and design and everything else. And so Aaron is going to take off the high priestly garments. They will be placed on his son Eliezer, and then Aaron will die and will be buried there. The second one, and we mentioned this, is Moses equipping and preparing Joshua. And this is something that's given in a lot of different detail in different places, but here's some highlights. I'm always amazed at what we learn about the name and the nature of God as Scripture unfolds. And notice what Moses says, "Let the Lord, the God of the spirits of all flesh, appoint a man over the congregation." And the same Moses who's going to be told, "I am who I am, Yahweh," and Abraham knew God as El Shaddai, then Moses describes God as being the God of the spirits of all flesh. And let him appoint a man over the congregation who will go out before them, come in before them, who shall lead them and bring them in, that the congregation of the Lord may not be as sheep who have no shepherd. And that's a significant term. When God's people do not have leadership, and this is going to be seen like in the Gospel of Mark, before Jesus feeds the 5,000, he just says, "Oh, here are people who are like sheep without a shepherd." And basically, a flock of sheep without a shepherd are totally vulnerable. There's no one to protect them, there's no one to care for them, and the fatality that is going to happen to that flock is very serious. And so Joshua is going to be commissioned. Moses will lay his hand on him. But if you look at the verse just before number 5, charge Joshua, encourage and strengthen him, for he shall go over at the head of this people and put them in possession of the land you will not see. We've mentioned number 5, and you can read through this. God says very specifically, I didn't choose you because you were strong and mighty, when you were weak and you were few. And this describes that. But number 6 is really significant, and we're going to see Jesus mentioning this when he is asked, Teacher, which is the greatest commandment? And the rabbis had counted 613 commandments. And so when you understand that, when they ask, which is the greatest commandment, he has 612 chances of being wrong. But there's no hesitation. Just like that, he says the first commandment is what? Love God with your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And this is given to us specifically here in Deuteronomy 6. And you'll see the underlined, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one. And you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might. And then as this continues into chapter 6, then here's this section where Moses says, look at all the different ways and places that I want you to talk to and teach the next generation. When you sit down, when you get up, when you walk along the way. And I like to think of 2 specific things. I think we need to have structured times, and I'm thinking with our children, our grandchildren, and then there are times as we go by the way. They're very important. We have 8 grandchildren, and each year I try to take each of the grandchildren by themselves to the state fair. So I buy an annual pass, I buy a parking pass, and I can get up early or stay up late working on lessons. And so with the older ones, as we go, then we put the prophets and the books of the Old Testament in order on the way. And then we talk about God's creation and the things that we see. And then with the younger ones, we sing. And so every year, then I try to take 8 kids to the fair and have times Fingerprints of Faith. Our family goes to South Texas Memorial Day in the next week. And as the 7-year-old daughter says, Papa takes the boys to breakfast and the ladies to lunch. So we have 6 boys, and so I take each one of the boys by themselves to breakfast, and we're close to a lighthouse, a functioning lighthouse, the furthest one south. We're about 20 miles from Old Mexico, and talk about you are the light of the world. Christians are to be salt and light and leaven. And probably 5 times each year, I try to send a handwritten note to each one of them and talk about, we're glad you're in our family. We want you to grow up to be like Jesus. And what I'm saying is that we should be very intentional about Fingerprints of Faith. And the last thing I want to say is that for those of us who have adult children, when they become adults, they can choose to do what they want to do. And if and when a child is not faithful, I oftentimes think the one person who has failed more at parenthood than anyone else is God. If it required a majority of faithful people for the sun to come up tomorrow, it wouldn't come up. If it required a faithful majority of people for it to rain, this would be the Sahara Desert. So when we've done the very best we can, God understands when we have children who don't follow Him. But then the other side is never take for granted if a child is faithful as an adult, he or she will always be faithful. And every time we can try to encourage them and strengthen them in their faith and their walk and their fellowship is something that we need to do. And of all things here in Deuteronomy 6, love the Lord your God with your heart, your soul, your mind, your strength. And while you're on earth, do everything you can, and may I use my expression, to put fingerprints of faith on the next generation. And all of us are called to do that specifically in the generation in which God has brought us into the world. And I'd just like to encourage us to be very intentional and deliberate in doing that in our day. God bless. Thank you.